Okay, we might get started. Welcome to everyone and thank you so much for joining the webinar today. So the webinar today is on how to maintain service delivery in the face of COVID-19, looking at risk management and business continuity planning for settlement providers. So today we have our guest speaker, Matt Dorfstaetter, and Matt is a disaster and crisis management professional. For the past decade, he has been deploying overseas on humanitarian missions and has operated domestically in various disaster coordination roles. He has been involved in operational and research activities for the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, and Victorian bushfires and Queensland floods. Matt's passion is managing uncertainty in complex situations, and he specialises in risk, intelligence, and security management. For the past 2 years, Matt was the Director Strategic Information and Security for the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. He is currently Director on the board of the International Society for Integrated Disaster Risk Management, and recently started as Managing Director with a boutique consultancy, Adaptive by Design. So without further ado, I will let Matt present.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Samantha, and thanks to everyone who joined us today to this webinar. I'm looking forward to you today for sharing some of the experiences we had with crisis management and particularly how it's applicable for your organization for the planning. So I'll start with the presentation and I'll attempt to share that in 1 second. So please bear with me. So it should now be up and running. So welcome again and thanks very much for joining us. So today in this webinar, we'll be talking about service delivery, as Amanda said, and I aim to provide you with a high-level overview of key activities that can take place today in order to prepare you for you and your business for tomorrow. Ahead with the COVID-19 crisis. To notice that there is that I will add some elements to the traditional business continuity planning approach, as I don't think that the traditional approach is sufficient, as with COVID-19, our life has pretty much changed significantly and the impacts will have a long-lasting consequences on the society and on how we run business and how we operate it with employees and so on. So, without further ado, I think that we need to get used to and comfortable with the fact that we are operating in for a prolonged period of time in a so-called new norm. So I'll introduce a few tools that allow you to prepare your organization for this new norm. Traditional business continuity planning usually assumes that you can recover completely and you aim to get back into the previous state that you used to wear into. Currently with the crisis, and as it's typically when a country, or in this case, the world faces such a big, complex scenario, there is such a new norm, as I said. And so it's really counterproductive to try to get back to where we used to be, and we need to be innovative and stay competitive in the 21st century. So we don't want our organizations to go back to the previous state, but we want to make sure that we thrive in this environment and come out strong. So this presentation will take about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll make sure that we have at the end a bit of time left to take some of the questions. And knowing that I want to be able to answer all of the questions today, please feel free to reach out to me on my LinkedIn account or via email if you seek any clarifications or help with your business continuity planning. So as Samantha mentioned, my profession is centered around breaking down complexity, and that's typically done by applying simple processes to achieve a desired outcome. The outcome that we want to achieve is readiness for the future in terms of ensuring that we can provide settlement. So today we will attempt to touch on and provide you with the tools to answer the following questions. What does the COVID-19 crisis mean for my organization? And how can we set us up for success into the future? What parts of the business need to be operational during these times? And do we as a business need to change our priorities? And if so, how do we do that? And how can we prioritize some of our business operations over others? What is the process for prioritizing that? And how can we go through that in a thought-through manner, which is pretty much the essence of business continuity analysis. And most importantly, how can we come out of this crisis stronger? And for the purpose of this, I wanted to introduce the concept of design thinking, which I see a very nice fit in business continuity planning, as it allows us to be innovative and come up with solutions for the challenges that we face. My objective for this webinar is that they provide a basic overview and introduce you some of the tools that you could use to prepare your organization for the time ahead. So most importantly, I think that every organization needs to be able to define the boundaries. Defining a line for where your settlement service delivery starts and ends is particularly important. So having a clear picture in your head about what your business looks like during and after a crisis will allow you to protect it when unrealistic demands hit. For example, if you're faced with a service request of an increase of 200% and you cannot cope with that, you need to have a process in place for saying, sorry, I can't. All too often when we face disasters, we have organizations that face limited resources and increased demands. And in the absence of having a process to manage that demand, organizations can break down. And that usually goes hand in hand with the employees being burned out and the organization not being able to help anyone. So we really want to avoid that. So let's start with the basics. Why do we need to understand risk? So risk, positive and negative, will allow us to plan for the unexpected. And by looking at risk, we as an organization have the edge over our competitors who don't tend to do so, as we're simply going to be more effective when required to change our organization due to external pressures. And currently, we're facing significant and managing surprise. So in this sense, crisis management is about having an organizational process to deal with such a surprise. You can develop multiple scenarios of what that surprise might look like and go through the planning steps to get prepared for these. And we'll be touching on some of that later and how to do that. But example of such surprises for your industry might be a shortage of translator services due to increased demand or rising costs, a significant reduction of employees as they might be falling ill or have to take care of someone who falls ill or have to stay home during quarantine, or a downtime in internet connection, which is in current times where we heavily rely on that, quite a significant impact. So how do we deal with those consequences? And just a note here, when we look at crisis management, I usually like to consider that the COVID-19 crisis has already happened, is already underway. So when we talk about managing a crisis, we're not talking about managing the current extent of. We talk about additional things that can happen in the crisis that we want to get prepared for. So our collective challenge is to understand our new norm and plan for the disruption scenarios which are more likely due to occur. So we have to agree that we have a new baseline to plan from, which is the current crisis, which the current restrictions, and we have to come up with scenarios of how the future might look like in order to plan for that. And starting from this platform will allow us to foresee and estimate potential consequences and prepare for what might come next. So considering this, business continuity management is about ensuring that the process is in place to deliver critical services during a crisis. And before we go into the technicalities of planning, I wanted to leave you with a fact that inspired me over the years, and one of the reasons why I choose disaster management as my full-time profession. So obviously, crisis and disaster management can be terrible, and horrific events can dishearten us and make us feel paralyzed, facing a lot of uncertainty. But as always, we have the opportunity to look at events from two perspectives. And the Japanese and Chinese alphabet, the kanji, one of the written characters, uses two brush strokes to write the word crisis. And one of that stands for danger, and the other one stands for opportunity. And therefore, I think it's really important, since this is embedded in a culture thousands of years old, to understand that every crisis brings its opportunities. So while we have to deal with the things that are not nice, we can also look at what we can leverage from the crisis in order to get out of it stronger. So from my point of view, there is, if we really want to simplify the steps that I would take in times like this, if I would run an organization such as yours, then I think we can, at the minimum, reduce it down by simplifying it quite significantly to 4 steps. And we can undertake those 4 steps right now to get ready. And I can't go into the specifics because obviously we don't have enough time, but I'll highlight some key messages and focus points in those steps. So the first one is quite obviously one: we need to get information. We need to have information about the pandemic, about the potential impacts, the internal environment, external pressures, pretty much everything that helps us understand our organization and our environment fully. Second one would then be the assessment of key risks to our organizations. And armed with the understanding of those risks, we can then go into the development of scenarios, so-called disruption scenarios, which is the key trigger point for business continuity planning. And I think getting the disruption scenarios pitched at the right level is probably one of the hardest challenges that you're going to face if you choose to run such a process for your organization. And after we have our disruption scenarios, we go into our business impact analysis. And this step allows us to see how our organization is potentially going to be affected, and will highlight the capabilities that are required to manage such a disruption. So you will predict specific consequences, consider a more specific disruption on your people, assets, IT, or supply chain. So in this third step, pretty much we're going to focus on applying the design thinking methodology that I talked before briefly to come up with innovative and sustainable solutions to the challenges that we face. And the fourth and last step is writing the business continuity plan. We'll just touch briefly on that and give some tips and hints of how to do that. So let's get started with the first step in gathering information. So starting with an understanding your organization first, now is a good time to rethink some of your basic pillars that make your organizations up. So without knowing who you are and what you stand for, it's pretty much impossible to move into a meaningful way of managing uncertainty. And as I talked before about it, the environment around us is changing. Pretty much the way we work is changing, and probably has a significant effect on the future of how we will work in the future with our workforce, with our clients. And as all of the things are changing, at the minimum, I would suggest that before you undertake a business continuity planning activity, you're going to have a look at your mission, which defines of what your organization is, what it will be, and why it exists, which is basically your reason for being. I don't think that will change dramatically, but it's good to reaffirm it. What will change is likely your capabilities, which in its sum define what your organization does. And that's basically what you need to do to perform your functions. So you need to have an online communication capability, marketing, whatever it might be. And the third thing I would like you to consider is your business function. And they define how your organization does things. Basically breaking your key functions down into people, process, technology, and information. And it talks about how you can make things happen. So we're talking about the why, we're talking about the what you do at a high level, and we talk about the how you're going to do it. And having that reassessed in times like that before you try to plan for any change of service delivery is probably a really good idea to make sure that you have a solid foundation to go from. So you and your employees have that knowledge. right now, it's probably not too much to gather. There's many other information elements that you need to get hold of, and you should ideally gather for establishing the context for your planning, right? So this information typically includes external and internal business continuity specific context, geopolitics, regulations, social, economic, locations, suppliers, and so on. Ensuring that you have the relevant staff and people involved will allow for your information provision throughout the process. So my tip is, don't really get bogged down onto that on that step in the process too much. Just make sure that you have the right people around the table when you conduct it, and that information will flow. However, do have a look at those three things before you start any activity. Then moving to our second step, the risk assessment, which we'll briefly talk about. So we won't go into the detail of risk management, as this is a whole subject in itself, obviously, but we have to move the wrong way. So typically your organization would have undertaken some sort of risk planning previously. And here you can see some of the basics of the ISO 31 standard, which is the principles, the framework, and the process. And knowing that we don't have time to talk about a lot of the things today, I just wanted to focus on the risk assessment process in light touch, which is comprised of the identification, the analysis, and the evaluation of risk. And the overall benefit of generating understanding through risk management is obviously that it generates more insight into your organization, your environment, and the things that can go wrong. Also, it's going to provide you a solid foundation for meaningful disruption scenarios, which are essential to take forward into your business continuity planning. And it allows you to prioritize which aspects of this challenge you want to take. How bad things can get and how long it takes to get bad. So with that in mind, some of the disruption scenarios in combination with your organization-specific risks may include a 70% workforce absence due to illness, a temporary shutdown of business locations due to quarantine, inability to access critical supplies for health service provisions if medications get short or whatever, and an overwhelming demand on domestic violence services, or business service change due to online service, which I think we're pretty much, all of us, in that disruption scenario right now. So the design of disruption scenarios can be one of the more challenging tasks in this process. There is no right or wrong way of doing that, as it depends completely on the organizational context, your resource availability, and how much you want to invest into the business planning activity. If you don't have much time and resources available, you might consider to use what's called meta risks or group risks. For example, you don't choose a specific scenario with lots of details, but you just want to approach internet failure as one of the risks, and you plan with that. That is a bit of a shortcut. It doesn't allow you the depth of analysis that you could have, but it's probably weighing up how much time you have to conduct various activities during these times. So one important thing to keep in mind is that these scenarios should push your organization beyond its comfort zone. Arguably, we all right now a bit pushed beyond our comfort zone because of the crisis, but coming up with scenarios is really to make sure that you do anticipate those next steps that your organization might face. So you expose yourself to uncomfortable questions in order to find the answer before the next crisis occurs. And moving to our third step, we want to talk about the core part of managing uncertainty around the business impact analysis and designing solutions. So let's start with that. So step one is about really having a whole organization performed about what is going on and what you're doing. So in the current situation, I believe that almost every organization would have regular patterns of communicating with the employees about uncertainty. And there is no difference if you conduct a business continuity planning exercise. You want to have everyone informed and critical people involved. You then draw on your prior discussed understanding of business capabilities and functions. And some of these will be more critical than others. But just to illustrate it with an example, I think if you would have asked us 4 months ago if online communication was an essential capability for most businesses in Australia, you would have had maybe a 50% rate who would have said, yes, it's one of a critical service. I think now we're pretty much up to 95% who would define it as critical. So it's another example that your organizational values and capabilities need to change. Step is then step number 3, determining the level of resourcing for each critical business function. So this determination typically includes people, facilities, equipment, IT systems, information, budget, transportation means. Hey Sam, I think I just popped out. Could you give me a quick indication where people, where I might have dropped out?
Yes, hi. You've been dropping out for a while. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear.
I couldn't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes. So yeah, just on your last PowerPoint slide, if you can go through that slide again, that would be wonderful, I think.
When did I drop out? Do you know?
You've been dropping out on and off, but the last one was the biggest. Yes.
It's sort of interesting to talk about unreliability in terms of
Very
internet.
coincidental. So yes, just maybe go through your last PowerPoint slide. I think that would be really helpful for everyone.
No problem, and apologies for that. So let's move back a couple of steps. The business functions, identify resource requirements. And I think when I talked about the establishing of the interdependencies, my connection was pretty weak. So to use an example, I have obviously an interdependency of providing online communications with my internet provider, internet connection. So it's a good example of one of the more obvious impact of each of the option scenarios functions. And this step is really key to success. And I would suggest to use some sort of risk assessment methodology and metrics that you have used previously in order to not to reduce the workload on your staff. And after you have done that step successfully, you're moving to identifying the acceptable outage time for each of those critical business functions. And that time typically represents the maximum period of time that an organization can tolerate the loss of a critical business function. So for example, right now I'm scheduled to talk on this webinar for about 1 hour. I think that maximum acceptable outage time for my connectivity would be about 2 minutes, and then people probably get annoyed and hang up. So that's about identifying the outage and the recovery times. And then we move on to step number 7, which is the identification of the workarounds. And this is where I would suggest to apply design thinking methodology to provide your organization with a strong tool to prepare you for the new norm. So when we talk about identifying alternative workarounds, we quickly reach our limitations with the common approaches, such as brainstorming. And that is due to our internal biases, the preconceived ideas and other limitations come into play. And all of that doesn't really allow us to effectively harness the information that we have in our organization. So my suggestion would be to utilize a design thinking process that allows us to disregard all of that and design solutions to problems, or even better, come up with a strength-based approach quickly and effectively. So the most common workarounds usually in a business continuity plan are manual ones. And from a traditional business continuity planning and crisis management perspective, particularly in our current COVID-19 crisis, I would strongly suggest that we need to put more effort into identifying how we can work on identifying sustainable, competitive, and innovative solutions. So one way to do that is by applying the design spiral, which when you apply the process, and let us use examples to illustrate the basic applications. So let's say our example is that we identified the disruption scenario of limited communication capacity for our outreach programs to deliver language education programs. So basically our staff is unable to travel and deliver what previously was home-based language education service. This is our problem statement, and we want to identify a workaround for that. So with a traditional workaround process, you would probably do some brainstorming and find solutions for reestablishing that service. So likely you would come up with a service delivery model that doesn't require transportation. Hence, for example, an online education model might be picked as your preferred solution. With the design thinking mindset, you would start at the discovery phase, and you would try to identify everything there is in relation to this client, to your service, to your needs, and to the outcomes. You would find this feeling. And this is not specific. So in this phase, you might discover that the real problem when you serve your client is something that you didn't expect. So for example, the reason why they would have taken language education in the first place was a concern of social isolation and not the language learning for itself. So moving then to the next step, you would use that information and ideate how, not the service, but the basic problem can be overcome. You would ideate from a strength-based approach, trying to build on existing services, organizational strength, client strength, and overall opportunities. And you would apply training criteria to select the best solutions. And at the end, when you surround yourself with a diverse group of employees, in an engineering sense, but in the process, you may have come up with a prototype of an online computer game, which has embedded language learning capabilities, but it also allows the client to connect with others in his or her community. You come up with more innovative, more targeted solutions that address the real world problems. And this was obviously just an example, but the design thinking process basically allows you to be innovative in a structured manner and approach the underlying issues, pretty much going back to your mission of why is the organization there in the first place. And then you build on the identified strength and identify completely new ways of operating. And for each of those design thinking steps, there's hundreds of sub-techniques that you can apply, some very simple ones that quickly provide you with the desired outcome. And from my perspective, I've used the design thinking process for the last 3-4 years in developing countries to come up with innovative solutions in the humanitarian space. As usually, as Westerners, all too often we come into another country and enforce our own mindset, our own beliefs on them and apply solutions that are not fit for purpose. And from my experience, it really does make a difference if you go through those steps and make sure that you identify suitable innovative solution. And I want to note that you might want to jump to that design thinking process straight to solve current organizational challenges. The risk when you do that, you can obviously do that, but the risk if you do that is when you don't understand your risk and you don't understand your context, right? You might miss some of the key inputs to this process, which means that you would operating from misleading assumptions or not acknowledging objective organizational risks. And therefore you might come up with the wrong solutions or not sustainable solutions. So while this is a great process, I would encourage you to not apply it too early in your planning activity. So this was my suggestion for step number 7, when you identify the workarounds. And coming back to the complete business impact assessment, the last step of this is the determination of current preparedness levels of the critical business functions. This would typically involve the confirmation of appropriate resources and workarounds which are available to manage the agreed outage times, considering the identified dependencies and so on. So the last step we briefly discussed today is the documentation of all of this planning activity in a simple and logical manner. I know that's usually a compliance activity to have a business continuity plan, but most organizations that undertake business continuity planning from a compliance point of view are usually not really using the time efficiently, and the plans are not used during crisis. I've seen it many times being the shelf plans not used. So what would you have on a business continuity plan? You would have contact information for key stakeholders, instructions for using the plan, policy and industry standards as reference. You would have emergency response guidelines and defining when they're to be used, instructions for recovering operations, additional reference such as vendor, assets, emergency procedures, and so on. And you would have clear roles and accountabilities for all staff, which is probably the most important thing to be noted in business continuity plan. And having said that, please bear in mind that business continuity planning is key, but the plans by itself don't mean anything if your staff and yourself don't agree on how they will be used and what are the triggers for using what processes. So Dwight Eisenhower said, "Plans are nothing, plan is everything." And in my profession, that is really, I couldn't agree more with that topic. So I embedded some key resources that will help you to get further in your planning. Some of my favorite resources about design thinking, one of the practitioner's guides for business continuity management, some of the templates, crisis communication plans. There's a very good one that US Department of Health is using, and managing risks, a framework and a perspective on how to approach risk in order to get stakeholder buy-in and really utilize risk management for what it is, a really thoughtful solution to overcome challenges that you might not anticipate if you don't go through the process. So looking at the, so to recap, today we wanted to talk about key foundational consideration and basic steps and some online resources, and I hope that that has been delivered. I would encourage, do take the opportunity do take the current situation as an opportunity to grow, to become more strong and more resilient. We talked about how to gather information, what to consider when assessing risks, and the steps of running a business impact analysis. We focused on how we can come up with innovative solutions during this process that make sense in our crisis, and we briefly touched on the key components of a business plan. So looking at the questions that we raised at the start, I hope that I have provided you with some insights, some very high-level contemplations about some topics and some of the tools in the resources in order to get the answers that you seek to those questions. And on a personal note, I really wanted to wish you the best for the upcoming months and tackle tackle one challenge at a time. Whenever I've been in disaster operations, or we all know it, being in disaster challenging environments now, breaking complexity down is really by simplifying the process, writing down what is wrong, breaking it down into manageable components, and approaching one thing at a time. I think particularly now, since this is going to be our new norm, we cannot keep operating in an emergency mode. That means we have to find a new norm. We have to come to a planned process that allows us to breathe, that allows our employees to take care of their loved ones, and that does consider the challenges that are ahead that we might not foresee at the current time. So when applying the right tools, you'll be able to come out strong on the other side. And if you want to contact me, I left my LinkedIn. You can touch base with me via LinkedIn, or you send me an email directly, and I'll try to answer your questions and help out as much as I can. I think we have about 20 minutes question times for some of the ones that we can discuss right here and now. So I'll hand back to Samantha and stop sharing my screen now.
No, thank you so much, Matt. That was wonderful. And I think now more than ever, we really need to be looking at business continuity and risk management for settlement providers and SETS providers, because in such uncertainty, I think it is important for us to be planning ahead and seeing this as an opportunity, as you mentioned. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
If anyone has any questions, if you can just type the questions through the QA box, and then I can feed that through to Matt for his answers. So I think there's already sent to you, Matt.
Just opened the chat box. There's a couple of questions about a meeting code, which I think you have answered in the meantime.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, so just in the chat, there's a question in the chat.
What do you think are the most challenging aspects of undertaking business continuity planning in our current situation? Okay, I think mostly it's important to get the balance right. I think we all struggle with resources. We all struggle for time. And it can be overwhelming to talk about risk or business continuity planning in times where you might be stressed, you might be short on stuff, and you don't really have the time to invest in things. So getting the balance right of undertaking a thought through exercise while also making sure that you have a robust business continuity running, so you can't put your business on hold while you do that, is really key. So the balance of doing that is pretty much centered around understanding the key steps and then making your determination for your organization, which steps you want to invest more time in and which steps you can probably just lightly touch on. How do you keep staff motivated during these times? It's more a psychological question, but it's a good one. I think when you have, so the challenging thing that happens usually when you're faced with a disaster, and you have that in a coordination center, or when you're deployed overseas in a humanitarian environment constantly, you have people who, when we are faced with overwhelming demands, so we as a person have limited resources, we tend to go in survival mode. That means that our ability to use our normal brain, the neocort, moves back to the reptile brain, and people get in a tunnel vision, and we produce adrenaline in order to be extra efficient and make sense of that. So people would have been in an adrenaline mode now for probably more than a month. So having your staff, being your staff motivated is probably, I think, less of a concern, because people would want to help, would want to commit to the purpose if they believe in your mission of your organization. But making sure that motivation is not overshadowed by the reptile brain telling them to do just the pure survival is key. So by providing routine to staff, from my perspective, providing clear structure, upfront communication, and always tell them the facts. And if you don't know any facts, you tell them that you don't know any facts, provides that regularity that we can slowly move out of our reptile brain into the normal thinking, and we get used to the new norm. So I wouldn't build that in a motivation strategy for my staff.
Matt, another one coming through. We've got quite a few actually.
That's good. Do you think most business continuity planning activities are delivering successful outcomes? I think it's probably depending on the organization. I think most of people who have worked quite a bit know of a lot of examples where business continuity is not successful because it's not seen as priority. And from my experience, whenever I see an organization start a business continuity planning activity and it's seen to be the responsibility of the risk manager or of the change manager or whatever, it's doomed to fail. So the commitment has to come from top, and the involvement has to be complete. So every staff member has to be involved in the planning process, and you can only achieve that if you make sure that everyone sees the benefit for themselves, not just for the role that they're having, but also for themselves. So I think most business continuity activities are unfortunately not successful. As I mentioned in the first question, getting the balance right between not having it too complex, not getting burned out when you run the process is key to make it success.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Sorry, they're coming through really fast, so I'm trying to get them all across.
That's all right. Managing stress at your end. What do you see as the main challenge businesses will face in the future? I think probably the main challenge is to get used to the new norm, to accept that life as we know it to a certain degree will be changed forever, right? Workplaces and how employees work will always be different from now on. Pretty much how we travel will be different, probably for a number of years. And we have to get used to that. So I think the challenge is to accept the new baseline as our new norm, and then operating from that. If you accept that, you allow your organization to be tuned into the current environment, and that's why I mentioned in the steps before that understanding your mission, your capabilities, and your business function, and reviewing that right now is really a good time to have a solid foundation to embrace the new norm that we face.
There's more.
How do you deal with KPIs or contractual requirements in crisis? That's a very good question. It's typically depending on, first of all, who put the KPIs in place and for what purpose. We have a lot of time KPIs are from my perspective, KPIs are the last thing you want to use to perform any activity. It's pretty much the stick approach. You want to have other indicators and other intrinsic internal motivations for people to operate at the best practice level. If you use KPIs for contractual requirements, you pretty much follow a tick list approach. So if you have to do that for contractual requirements, my suggestion would be that you have a look at the key performance indicators that you have from a contractual perspective. You compare it with what you really want to have at an organizational level, and you see how you can marry them up in a process that is beneficial for you. So whenever you have external pressures on your organization from a reporting perspective, then you need to identify ways how you can build it into your processes to leverage off it, because you don't get around it. And if you do them just for the sake of compliance, then you'll probably waste your time. So there's ways of dealing with that in an efficient manner by embedding it throughout the organization.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry, I'm just typing another one to you.
You're welcome. In disaster situations, how do organizations change over a period of time, especially when adrenaline settles and it becomes a new reality? That's a very good question. In disaster, how do organizations change over a period of time? So you usually have Historically, this crisis management, disaster management, always assumed that you have that norm, then you have that pressure, that the shock that hits the organization, and during that shock period, you deal with the crisis, and then slowly you apply the business continuity plan, and you get back to norm, and you recover. You put your recovery activities in, and you're back into operation. I think also when we talk about something like COVID-19, that does slightly change. So organizations you'll see a lot of organizations failing, and a lot of organizations prevailing. And I think you will be even seeing more organization coming out of the blue that we didn't imagine needed to exist before. So how they change over time is a really good question. It's really organization dependent, and it's probably depending of organizational culture and how the leadership embraces the new change. In regards to the second part of that question, especially when adrenaline settles and it becomes the new reality, it's important to get your employees out as soon as you can out of that adrenaline state. So you can do it immediately in a few hours. If you have a disaster operation and you have something more spontaneous like a bushfire or a cyclone or an earthquake or something, and you go in a center, you see the people being on adrenaline, you can take immediate steps to reduce that. And I can post some literature about that, how to do that immediately. When we talk about a long-term situation like that, I think embracing the employees as a whole is quite important. So you have the work pressures that causes adrenaline. You have significant uncertainty, which people usually are not very good at managing. It's one of the most stressful things that people can expose to, uncertainty. And you have the people at home, the situation with the schools, that domestic violence is going to increase. The conflicts that we had prior and didn't were aware of are going to come to light now. So embracing people as a whole and embracing it on a real individual basis, one case-by-case approach would be my suggestion for that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. More coming through.
Next question is, how long would it take to undertake business continuity planning? So that is completely organization dependent. I have seen it undertaken over 2 years programs in very large organizations. I've seen it being done in 2 half-day workshops with the right people, right stakeholder, right information around the table. It's really depending on the outcome. Business continuity management and risk management is such a big term, and unfortunately it has the connotation that it's compliance-based and that it's something that we have to do, and it's not fun, and everyone usually gets bored when you talk about risk. It's usually not sold the right way, and the opportunities are not leveraged. So if it's applied correctly, I think you can have your organization go through an initial business continuity planning that sets you up for the future. In 2 workshops, 2 4-hour workshops probably would do the job initially.
Excellent.
Will you be able to share the PowerPoint? Yes, I sent the PowerPoint previously through to Samantha for sharing, not a problem.
Okay. I think that is everyone's questions that I can see. So thank you so much, Matt, for taking the time. I found that very valuable and informative, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. And yes, we've got your contact details. So yes, please feel free, everyone, to make contact with Matt if you have any questions, or to get in contact with myself if there's anything that we can help with as well. Yeah, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. I hope you have a good day and take care of yourself, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.